Most hunters don't practice with the rifles the way they should. No, seriously, they don't. I've said that a lot, and I mean it. I've thought more about that the past few months. Railwood shooting is quick. You need to know your rifle. Often requires a second shot. And that's where a gun like the Remington 121 comes in. Now, this is a beautiful little gun. Kind of special to me. It was my great-grandfather's. So I'd be 4th generation. With my kids shooting it, I'd be 5th generation. And the 121 was predated by the Model 12 Remington pump, right? I believe. Which was early 1900s. 121 was mid-1930s to mid-1950s. And then we've got from the 1950s until Remington was no longer was the Remington 572. Little 22 pump. So a perfect gun to practice with, particularly if you hunt with the Remington 7600. Right? It's kind of a mini-me version of the 7600. I mean, some might view it as collectible. I think they made a couple 100,000 of this particular model. So, I mean, I think there's plenty of them available. Most of them are pretty beat up. You know, like this one, I shouldn't say beat up. Most of them are well used. And this one is no different. This is a well-used gun. But I'll tell you, she's still tight and smooth. And I wouldn't dare say how many shots have been fired with this little gun. But that's the point. Is it's given someone tons of practice. And that's the real value that this little gun teaches us. And, you know, say the Remington 552 that I use, because that kind of mimics my 7400. There's a lot of value in that. And this is the type of rifle that previous generations grew up on, right? If you look at kind of my generation going back, I think every little boy started with a BB gun. Carried that wherever we went. I don't know if kids do that nowadays. We'll get to that in a minute. But back, we'll say my generation, previously, everyone started with a BB gun or a pellet gun. And then as they evolved, got a little bit older, young adults, maybe they got a 22, shot the heck out of that, and then the evolution continues. And if you think of practically what that did for that little fella carrying the BB gun or the pellet gun, eventually the 22, they're just having fun. They're out shooting nonstop in real life practical situations. It not only developed your shooting skills, but it developed you as a hunter. And it wasn't so readily apparent. It wasn't like you were practicing, per se. You're just having fun. But in that, you're learning some valuable skills. It's skills that require rhythm, balance, coordination, target acquisition, trigger control, the whole 9 yards. I don't think that happens nowadays. And guns like this little pump help hone those skills perfectly. I think a lot of people realize the importance of having a gun like this that's close to their hunting rifle. They see the value in that. And that's great to cognitively understand that. But nowadays you have to intentionally get out there and do it. It's not like it used to be, right? This little gun, the more you shoot it, it's going to point out your weaknesses real quick because there's not much for recoil. Those who have issues flinching, it's going to be noticeable on this gun. Those who have poor trigger control, it's going to be noticeable on this gun. All those little nuances that you wouldn't notice with a higher recoiling gun, it's going to be more apparent on a gun like this. And one of the most important parts of it is the fact that ammo's cheap, so you don't feel pressure to go just shoot a few shots and call it good. You can basically shoot as much as you want and not feel that guilty about it. But that's where the fact that this is a generational piece, that's where that really comes in. Because we talk, those, my generation and earlier generations started with a BB gun. The fact that they carried this all the time, you look at something I've really thought about recently. You look at a lot of older gentlemen, and I guess when I was a kid, and maybe it was just me being a kid, but you always think that, wow, that guy's a good shot. Like, he's just naturally a good shot. He must have been born a good shot. I don't think people are really born a good shot. It's a skill that's developed. Yes, we may have, variable degrees of visual motor skills, and some people are just naturally better at those skills. But as far as shooting is concerned, for the most part, I think it's a learned skill. And all these, we'll call them old timers for the sake of this video, but all these old timers grew up with a gun like this, kind of shooting nonstop. And you tend to forget how important that is, right? They had tons of volume working with a gun as a kid, where you absorb things like a sponge, and just that repetition over and over and over, putting the time, the volume, and the reps in, and you just develop those skills without actually knowing you're doing it. And I think that's something that's changed nowadays. You know, if you think about how, at least where I live, I'm pretty fortunate that to go practice with my gun, it's convenient, or at least more convenient than most places. I can pretty much in northern Maine go wherever I want. I can go right out back. I live in a rural community outside of the town limits, so I can just get out of my backyard and shoot. So basically for me to practice, it's simply just coming up and grabbing a gun and going out back. I will say nowadays that it seems like shooting has become more of a formal affair, particularly if you live in a less rural community. So most people where they live, in order for them to practice, they got to be a member of a gun club, you know, or they're a member of a range because they need someplace to go and shoot. There's more constraints, right? There's a higher barrier to practice. We'll call it maybe your membership fees. That's a barrier. Then you got to get your gear together. You got to travel to the location, and you get there, get set up. Might be other people. Other people being there and other eyes on you might influence how you're going to practice. So you may not practice really the way you should. You may just stick to some bench shooting, and it's good to know that your rifle's on, but that's less practical in the real world, at least for us up here. Then you've got to travel back, get home, clean your equipment, whole 9 yards, and that can consume half a day, 3/4 of a day, maybe a whole day if you do a lot of shooting. So practice nowadays is more of a formal affair, right? So if you back up to those earlier generations, their practice was just play, basically. They're out in the back 40 with their buddies. Maybe they're fishing a brook. They get their BB guns with them. They're honing skills without even knowing it. And I think that's gone. I really do. It didn't dawn on me until, I don't know, maybe a few months ago or so. You know, those days of getting home from school and grabbing a gun, you get 2 or 3 hours of light, walk down the road. Because I actually, as a kid, I lived in town, and it was nothing for me to grab a gun, shotgun or whatever, head down the street, out into the woods at the end of the road. And then you get outside the town limits and you start hunting. I don't know what would happen nowadays if somebody did that. It probably wouldn't be good. I'm sure someone would be calling somebody. But yeah, it's a dying thing. The convenience factor of becoming a good shooter is, there's definitely a greater barrier to honing your skills nowadays. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know of the younger generations that are developing as hunters have that opportunity to develop those skills as readily and as easily, and probably as good in a practical way that a lot of us did when we were kids. And I'm definitely not an old timer, but I know my generation. I'm a millennial. Most of the kids I grew up with BB guns, and then, you know, that transitioned into a little 22 and so on and so forth. And I don't know of anyone doing any such thing nowadays. So it's a bit of a shame. So yeah, it's more than just, you know, the 121, which is a special gun to me. As I mentioned, it's my great grandfather's. It means something more than just, you know, a practice piece, but it's developed a lot of hunters. It helped you understand it's not about tiny groups or the perfect conditions or a formal practice session, but it's really about developing rhythm, balance, and it really makes you a better hunter. So I feel bad that, you know, these younger generations are missing out on that. There's a missed opportunity, I think, nowadays for that younger generation to just become one with their shooting skills. And you did it by accident, you know, or I shouldn't say by accident. You did it by just having fun. And so it wasn't intentional. And nowadays to become a better shooter, you definitely have to be intentional with it. Yeah, I've been thinking about that for a little bit. And I saw this 121 sitting around. I'm just thinking, yeah, that's, this gun has got a lot of stories. And you can see with every mark and every scratch, every little divot in the metal, I'm sure it has a pretty interesting story. I wish I knew what all the stories were. I'm sure there's some great ones. So, and there's nothing I like better than a gun that has a story. Yeah, I would like to think things could change, but I don't foresee that. I don't foresee that. But anyway, grab a gun that mimics your hunting rifle, that's cheap to shoot, easy to shoot, that you can spend a lot of time with, and you won't regret it. If you kind of just shoot for 1 or 2% every time you go out, just 1 or 2% better, and you do that a lot, man, those little gains, they add up real fast. And they give you confidence out in the field when that day comes. So, yeah, get out there and shoot. It's good for the soul. See ya. I like guns with a story, that's for sure. Oh, I forgot to mention too, this gun has a little Weaver 4-power scope on it, which we don't really use because it's pretty cloudy. This kind of has like an over-under sight. So I think we typically use the iron sights, but it's period correct. Looks fitting on the little gun. I'm not really sure of the model of it, but probably should have checked that out. Anyway, it's getting late.